This story is called My Favorite Day. Spring. This is my favorite day of the year. Each time I see the outline of the pier jutting from the downstream bank, I get this shimmer in my stomach, knowing that before the sun is hot in the sky, I'll be meeting my new friends. Sorry, let me explain. In the space between death and the end, there's a river. And, yes, a ferry. But unlike those stories we used to tell, the ferry doesn't take you across the river. It takes you down it. For one whole year, it journeys downstream with its crew of souls until... well, we'll get to that. Now, how do I know all this? I'm the ferryman. I haven't always been, and I may not always be, but for now, it's me. And today I get to meet a whole new group of souls. I know right now they might be scared, confused, even angry, but I think with a little nudge here and there I can help them find some peace. I'm really excited. Wow, that did not go to plan. Things started well enough. I lashed the ferry to the pier, waved happily to the huddle of figures on the shore, then jumped out and headed straight for them. I knew exactly what I was going to say. By now my well-worn ritual fit like a pair of perfectly aged slippers. I'd reassure them, welcome them, then run through what they could expect from the coming months. They'd have questions. They always had questions. And I'd have answers. I was ready. I thought I was ready. As I approached, individual faces started to come clear, each one gazing intently in my direction. I didn't recognize any of them. I'd never met someone in the Riverlands who I knew in life, and it didn't seem like today would be any different. When I was within comfortable earshot, I raised my hand again in greeting and beamed. "Hi, everybody! Look, I know you're probably..." Just then a shortish woman with searching eyes and sensible shoes stepped out from behind a few of the others and stared straight at me. "Mum." All my polished words vanished instantly. What I mean is, I took a deep breath and tried to regain a smile. I had a job to do. People were counting on me. "I know you're all probably anxious to know where you are and what you're doing here. Good news is, I'm here to help. The important thing to know is that you're safe, you've got nothing to worry about, and in just a minute I'm going to answer all your questions. A few things first, though. As you've probably figured out amongst yourselves by now, you're no longer in the land of the living. You're in the Riverlands now, and we all have a journey ahead of us." Mum's gaze bored into me. I tried to focus anywhere else as I explained to my fresh new crew about the trip downriver, then turned to their onboard duties. Now, everyone has to work for their room and board. There's a lot to get done each day, but we'll all pull together and do our bit. This is non-negotiable, I'm afraid. If you repeatedly refuse to pull your weight, I'll have to put you to shore. Those are the rules. I don't get a say in it. And while the river's banks are often quite lovely during the day, when night falls, they aren't a good place to be. Please trust me on this. Please. I risked a glance back in Mum's direction. Her face was unreadable, but there was no warmth there, no softening. I swallowed and went on. "Okay. Any questions?" Our first few months have definitely had their ups and downs. One of the crew, let's call her M, somehow managed to squirrel away every single safety float on board. I'm not fully sure what the thought process was there, but it seems like having them all to herself made her feel more secure somehow. I gently explained to her that in all my voyages the ferry had never yet had a mishap, and that perhaps stockpiling all the floats wasn't the best way to stay safe. Despite all that, I think it was some calm encouragement from a couple of her fellow crew that finally persuaded her to relinquish her hidden stash. Q, a man whose first question to me was whether the room and board rule really applied to everyone, tried to organize a work roster that had them overseeing. I noticed what was happening fairly quickly, but didn't step in straight away. Some of the crew fell in line with his orders, but it wasn't long before a group of them approached Q, reminding him that yes, working for your keep really did apply to everyone, and everyone included him. He wasn't happy about it, but eventually he picked up a mop and got to work. And Mum? She's not been a problem passenger, not at all, but I don't think she's forgiven me for what happened. We've barely said 10 words to each other outside of the day-to-day business of running the ferry, and I don't really know how to bridge that gap. She did come up to me hesitantly a week or so ago, right after the noon meal, but just as she started to speak, I had to rush off and break up a fight between T and Q over meal portions or some nonsense. It's probably for the best. We never really knew what to say to each other. Summer. It's been a tough summer. Q actually tried to lead a mutiny. He said that if they all put me to shore and turned the ferry round, they had a chance at life again. I thought Mum might speak up at that, and it almost looked like she might, but in the end she stayed quiet. Fortunately, when it came down to it, most of the crew could see just how absurd Q's claims were, and people drifted away while he continued to rant. T, a woman who loved being the centre of attention but hadn't otherwise caused much trouble, broke into the hold one night. She gorged herself on the supplies there and took a bunch of food back to her cabin for later. When she eventually got caught, the crew held a big meeting and decided that everyone, T included, would have reduced portions for a week to compensate for the loss. At the end of that week, I quietly pulled T aside and told her that next time she stole from her fellow crew, I'd have to put her to shore. But I think after a week of watching her friends go hungry alongside her, she had no real desire to try it again. Mum and I finally spoke. I kind of wish we hadn't now. The sun was starting to dip below the tree line as I weighed anchor for the day when she came up beside me and quietly cleared her throat. Too busy to talk? I turned in surprise, quickly finished what I was doing, then shook my head. No, not at all. How can I help? You're punishing me, aren't you? I'd imagined this conversation 100 different ways. This was not one of them. I'm sorry, what? You're punishing me, right? All those times I refused to believe when I didn't get behind your little fantasies and causes. Well, you were right, sort of. There is an afterlife after all, and you're here with a kindly pitchfork to prod me into enlightenment. Mum, that is not what is happening. I didn't choose this. I'm trying to help people. She gave me a hard glance. You're always quite keen on that, weren't you? Sacrificing everything for whichever stray or lost cause you came across. I sighed. There it was. She hadn't forgiven me for that day. Mum, I warned you, didn't I? I said it wasn't worth it. People love standing up for their cause, don't they? But like I told you so many times, it always ends in violence. Mum, we were protesting non-violent. You still died. The words crashed down between us. The last of the sun winked out, and from the corner of my eye I glimpsed something that moved all wrong, scuttling through the deep shadows between the trees. The silence stretched out, and she turned to me and nodded once. Good night, son. Autumn. As we come into the lower reaches of the river, the dark, evergreen forests give way to deciduous groves. We've had the chance to make a few day stops along the way, giving people a few moments to savour the colours of the season and stroll amongst the leaves. Even Em, who'd always been terrified of going ashore, broad daylight or not, was eventually coaxed onto the bank and actually seemed to enjoy herself, kicking through the bright leaves. One of the most popular onshore activities was running races. Q excelled at these and came first in almost every event by a good margin. One day, though, T put on a burst of speed right at the end of the race and managed to pass Q at the last moment. It looked for a bit like things might get ugly, but after a tense moment, Q laughed and extended his hand to the victor. As the riverside foliage shifted from green to yellow to orange, Mum and I sort of kept out of each other's way, speaking cordially but coolly whenever we had to. But one shore day, As I spotted her sitting alone under a flame-crowned tree, I decided to ball up my courage and say something. I strolled up, carefully casual, and sat beside her. "It's beautiful along the river, isn't it?" She looked at me for a moment, then gave a small smile and nodded. "It really is. Look, Mum, I know you might think I'm here to, exact revenge. Yeah, but I know. This isn't about me. I get that now." She waved her hand at the vibrant woods and grinned. "It'd be a pretty poor punishment, wouldn't it? I was angry with you, I think you know that. I still don't understand why you would throw your life away for something like that. If you really thought about it rationally, it didn't make a drop of sense. Why you'd leave us behind for that." I watched the river sparkle in the afternoon light for a while before I replied. "You're right. My big ideas about what comes next and so forth were pretty wide of the mark. I wish I could go back and live a more rational life, but no, you don't. That's not who you are. And that's okay. I just wanted to do the right thing. But I didn't always think about how that would affect the people I cared about. I'm sorry." She looked at me for a moment, then gently pulled me into a hug. "So am I." Winter. Our journey's almost over. In my first few voyages as ferryman, I thought that winter would be an anxious season. After all, I'd always been honest about what was coming. But this time, like most of the voyages past, there was an almost festive air among the crew. We decided to put on a special meal, which everyone had a part in preparing. When I placed T, our erstwhile supply thief, in charge of organizing the food, a few people complained, but in the end, she delivered an incredible feast, and not one morsel went missing. M had prepared a festive hymn for the occasion. She trembled a bit as she stood up to sing, but her voice was strong and clear, and everyone applauded thunderously when she finished. I clapped enthusiastically along with the rest, then leaned back against Mum as she cracked a joke and stretched an arm around me. Mum and I have finally had the chance to connect. She'll often find excuses to do chores next to me, and I'll drop by her cabin regularly to check in on her and chat. We both know it can only last so long. One crisp morning, as snow dusted the now bare shores around us, it finally appeared. I called all the crew up on the deck and told them to get ready. In the distance, steadily growing closer, was a thick fog bank that blanketed the river and obscured the shore on either side. This was the end. M passed from person to person, giving hugs and quiet encouragement in equal measure. Q went to stand at the front of the ferry, intent on showing the others there was nothing to fear. Mum and I stood next to each other, smiling a little tearfully and tightly clasping hands. Then we all plunged into the grey. I closed my eyes. Just like each time before, I felt the fog washing me, stripping me back till there was nothing left but my very core and my memories. These I'm allowed to keep, piled up and glinting like a dragon's hoard. When I opened my eyes again, I was alone on the ferry, and in the distance I could just make out the shadow of the pier jutting from the downstream bank. This is my favorite day of the year.